In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and he saw that it was good. God created the sky and the land and the oceans, and then he saw that it was good. He created the plants and the bushes and the flowers and the trees, and he saw that it was good. He created the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky, and he saw that it was good. He created the fish in the ocean, he created the birds in the air, and then he saw that it was good. And then God created humanity. In his own image, in his own likeness, God created humanity. And when God saw all that he had made, he saw that it was very good. The creation story in Genesis chapter 1 tells us 7 different times that God looked at his creation and saw that it was good, until we get to verse 18. And in verse 18, God looks at the man that he has created and he says, "It is not good for man to be alone." 7 different times throughout the creation story, God looks around and calls his creation good, and yet the very first thing in all of creation that God describes as not good is being alone. And yet more people are more alone than ever before in human history. A couple of days ago, I did an experiment. I pulled out my phone, I went to my Urbane Cafe app, and I ordered a salad from Urbane Cafe. And then I got in my car, and I drove to the parking lot, and I parked my car, and I got out, and I walked up to the restaurants, and I walked past a line of people that were standing in line to order, and I went towards the back to the little pickup area, and I looked for the bag that said my name on it. I picked up that bag. I walked right out. I walked to my car. I got in my car. I drove in the same parking lot over to Sprouts. I went in to pick up a couple of groceries, went through the self-checkout, walked back out to my car, and then drove home. And the entire trip lasted a little over 30 minutes. And the whole time, I didn't talk to a single person. And friends, for more and more of us, that kind of isolated social experience is becoming normal. In 2023, the Surgeon General released a warning about what he called the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And in it, he reported that the amount of time that we spend alone has increased by 24 hours per month over the last 20 years. While the amount of time that we spend in person with friends has decreased by 20 hours a month. Among teenagers and young adults, which historically has been a uniquely social season of life, the decline has been even more significant. The amount of time the average teenager or young adult spends in person with friends has decreased by 55 hours a month. From an average of 75 hours a month in 2003, all the way down to an average of 20 hours a month in 2023. That's like 5 hours a week for teenagers and young adults. I don't want to bore you this morning with a bunch of statistics and graphs and data, but the research is consistently and abundantly clear that most people have fewer friends and spend less time with their friends and spend more time alone than ever before in human history. It's true of men, and it's true of women, and it's true across all age groups. It's become undeniably clear that just like Drew Hunter says in his book, Made for Friendship, he says, we have a friendship problem. So this morning, here's what we're going to do. We're going to continue our series on the life of King David by looking at David's unlikely friendship with a guy named Jonathan. And after we do a deep dive into their friendship, we'll spend the last few minutes talking about some ways to build and strengthen our own friendships. So, if you have a Bible or a Bible app, I'm going to invite you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel is the 9th book of the Old Testament. and we're going to be in chapter 18. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning or a Bible app, the verses are going to be on the screen behind me, so you'll be able to follow along. But if you have a Bible or Bible app, again, I'm going to invite you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18. And while you're turning there, let me just quickly remind you about what we've talked about so far. We've been in this series for a few weeks, so let me just go back and remind you of sort of where we've been in David's life so far. 3 weeks ago, we were introduced to Israel's first king, a guy by the name of Saul. And even though Saul was tall, dark, and handsome and had all the physical characteristics of a king, we quickly find out that he demonstrates a complete lack of godly character. We just see this repeated over and over in his life. After Saul makes a series of disobedient decisions, God chooses a new king, a young shepherd boy by the name of David. But David doesn't become king right away. In fact, immediately after the prophet Samuel anoints David as the future king of Israel, David goes right back out into the fields to tend his father's sheep. Until one day, when his father sends him to the front lines of the battle between the Israelite army and the Philistine army to check in on his older brothers. And it's here in the story of David, this young shepherd boy and future king, that he kills the giant Goliath, which is what we talked about last week, if you were here. And then immediately after those events, immediately after the events of Goliath and that whole scene, we pick up the story in chapter 18 and we read these words. This is 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. It says this, that after David had finished talking with Saul, King Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. In other words, he served in the royal courts. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Let's stop there. Now, for most of my life, I've been able to make friends pretty easily. And in fact, my mom loves to tell the story of my first day of kindergarten. I went off to kindergarten and I came back home and I was all excited to tell her about my new best friend. I said, Mom, I made a new best friend. And she said, oh, that's wonderful, son. What's his name? I said, I don't know, right? Because it didn't matter. Like, we played on the playground together. We were best friends. Like, I didn't need his name. Who needs details like that, right? We played on the playground together. We're best friends. So the next day, I actually went to school, and my mom the next day, she asked me, she said, so did you learn his name? And very proudly, I said, yes, his name is Flippy. And she looked at me. She's like, do you mean Felipe? Yes, that, yes. So I made best friends with Felipe, but you know what Felipe didn't do that first day that we established our friendship? He didn't start taking off his clothes and giving them to me like Jonathan does here in this story, right? In fact, in all of my years of friendship, I've never once had one of my friends take off their robe or tunic or belt and give them to me as a pledge of friendship, right? And if they did, it would have been a little awkward, right? It would have been a little bit strange. So when we read this, we have to sort of ask ourselves, so what's really going on in these verses? I mean, first of all, who is this guy Jonathan? Second of all, why is he giving David his clothes and his weapons? And then third of all, why does the Bible say that Jonathan became one in spirit with David and that he loved David as he loved himself? I mean, was this some sort of romantic relationship or something, or were they just really good friends? Okay, so first of all, let's answer some of these questions. First of all, Jonathan is King Saul's oldest son. We actually get introduced to him back in 1 Samuel chapter 14, where we find out that he's a young man who trusts God and he's a leader in his father's army. In fact, in chapter 14, there's a whole bunch of Philistine soldiers who mess around and find out that Jonathan is actually pretty good at fighting when he and his armor bearer take on 20 Philistines and win. So in chapter 14, we get a little bit of an introduction into Jonathan and who he is, but it still doesn't explain to us why here in chapter 18 he gives David his robe and his weapons. Well, what's happening here is that Jonathan is, number one, signifying his friendship with David, and then number two, he's acknowledging David's rightful place as the next king of Israel. See, remember that Jonathan was King Saul's oldest son, so he would have been next in line to be king, right? And so this exchange here in chapter 18 actually has tremendous legal and political significance. One Bible scholar describes it this way. He says, when Jonathan took off his robe, which was a symbol of the Israelite kingdom, and gave it to David, he was in effect transferring his own status as the heir apparent. A lot of legal and political significance here in this moment. Another scholar puts it this way: Jonathan transfers to David the rights and regalia of the crown prince. His robe, his tunic, his sword, bow, and belt. These actions carried both symbolic and legal significance. So this scene here in chapter 18 is actually a really big deal because number one, remember, Jonathan was King Saul's son, and number two, David had been anointed as the next king of Israel, which makes this relationship a really unlikely friendship, right? On one hand, you have who should have been the next king of Israel, and then on the other hand, you have the anointed, God-chosen anointed next king of Israel. We would expect for these two, Jonathan and David, to be political rivals and even enemies, but certainly not friends, right? I mean, this would be, to put it in modern equivalents, like Hunter Biden becoming best friends with Don Jr., right? Like that's the kind of situation that we have here, right? And we go, oh, that's not going to happen. Exactly. Like that's the point, right? We read this and we go, whoa, this is really unusual and highly unlikely. But that's what's going on here. But not only do David and Jonathan become friends, they become best friends, to the point that the Bible tells us that Jonathan was one in spirit with David, that he made a covenant of friendship with him, that he loved him as he loved himself. Now, for many of us, those phrases may sound a bit weird, right? Like one in spirit and covenant and loved him as he loved himself. Like that seems a little extreme, right? To some of us, these sound like strange things to say about a friend. But that's only because we're reading this through our kind of modern cultural lens. See, in the ancient world, this would have been a much more normal way to talk about a close friendship. In fact, C.S. Lewis, you're probably familiar with C.S. Lewis, he wrote a really famous book called The Four Loves. And in The Four Loves, he talks about friendship, and he describes friendship this way. He says, to the ancients, in other words, ancient people, friendship seemed the happiest and most fully human of all the loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue. The modern world, in comparison, ignores it. C.S. Lewis is contrasting sort of the way that ancient people thought about friendship. We in our modern culture tend to prioritize romantic relationships. In the ancient world, there was a high priority put on friendships. And so that's what we're reading about here in chapter 18. What we have here in 1 Samuel 18 is two young men who have formed a very unlikely but very deep friendship that actually ends up saving David's life multiple times over the next several years. Because if you continue reading verse 18, you'll quickly discover that Saul's opinion of David quickly has soured. All because Saul has become jealous. The king, Saul, has become jealous of this young shepherd boy. Because after David kills Goliath and then goes on into some other military exploits, David's success and popularity grows among the people. And so Saul becomes extremely jealous of David. In fact, his jealousy gets so bad that Saul tries to kill David by pinning him against the wall with a spear. We'll actually look more closely at that next week. But in the beginning of chapter 9, we're going to pick the story back up. So if you have a Bible, you're going to flip a page or maybe just look onto the next page in chapter 19. So again, Jonathan and David, best friends. Jonathan's dad, Saul, jealous of David. We pick the story up here in chapter 19, verse 1. So Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David, and he warned him, David, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you, so be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you, and then I'll tell you what I find out. So Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, like he hasn't done anything wrong. And what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed that Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and you were glad. So why would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? So Saul listened to Jonathan, sort of calmed down, and took an oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. In other words, serving back in the palace. Okay, whew. Crisis averted, right? Saul's jealousy kind of calms down. Okay, he welcomes David back in. Crisis averted. David's back in the good graces of the king, and they all live happily ever after, right? No, not exactly, right? Because if you know the story, you know that no sooner does Saul welcome David back into the palace that he erupts into another jealous rage and tries to kill David again. So David is forced this time to escape through a window under the cover of nightfall, and he goes to hide in a place called Ramah, where the prophet Samuel is living. And it's not very long before Saul and a group of his men who are out looking for David in this life and death kind of game of hide and seek, he goes out looking for David, comes to Ramah, and is looking for a way to kill him. And that's where we pick the story up again, this time in chapter 20. So in chapter 20, verse 1 through 4, we read this. That David, so David's in Ramah, but he leaves. So David fled from Naioth to Ramah and went to fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan, and he asked, Jonathan, what have I done? Like, what did I do wrong? What's my crime? How have I wronged your father? What did I do that was so bad that he's trying to kill me? And Jonathan kind of denies this. He's like, no way, never. Jonathan replied, you're not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything great or small without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It can't be so. But David swore and took an oath and said, your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said to himself, Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only one step between me and death. Jonathan said to David, what do you want me to do? Whatever you want, I'll do it for you. So let's stop there for just a second. Okay, so again, David is on the run. He goes to his friend Jonathan. He's like, Jonathan, do you know that your dad's trying to kill me? What's going on here? Jonathan's a little bit naive about this situation. He goes, why, are you kidding me? If my dad was trying to kill you, I would certainly know about it. He doesn't hide anything from me. He tells me everything. He would have told me. And David's like, no, he didn't tell you because he knows that you and I are friends. And so he didn't tell you. But he is trying to kill me. In fact, there's one step between me and certain death. And so Jonathan says, okay, well, let's come up with a plan. What do you want me to do? So David and Jonathan, I'll just summarize really quickly, come up with a plan. David says, here's what I want you to do. There's a festival coming up, and I'm supposed to attend the festival and eat dinner with your dad. But I want you to go to your dad, Jonathan, and I want you to make an excuse for me. To tell your dad that I had to go back to my hometown, Bethlehem, and spend time with my dad and my brothers. And then if your dad gets really mad, then you'll know that your dad's out to get me. But if your dad doesn't get mad, then I'm safe and I'll come back. And Jonathan says, okay, great. David says, but hang on, we got to come up with a way for you to be able to communicate this to me. We got to come up with a code. And so they come up with this plan that David's going to hide hide out in the field by this rock. And in a couple of days, after Jonathan has done the dinners with his dad and kind of monitored his dad's reaction, he's going to come back to that field, and Jonathan is going to shoot 3 arrows. And if he shoots the arrows further than the stone, then Jonathan knows that Saul is angry and he needs to take off and run away. But if Jonathan shoots the arrows close on this side of the stone, then David will know that Saul didn't get angry and that he can come back home. So, a couple of days go by. Jonathan goes to the feast with his dad. Dad says, hey, how come David's not here? Jonathan makes up the excuse, gives Saul the excuse, and Saul buys it and says, okay, maybe he's ceremonially unclean. Maybe that's why he didn't come. Okay, no problem. The second day of the feast, Saul sits down. He's got his military commander next to him. Jonathan's there, and there's a very open, empty space there where David was supposed to be sitting. And so he asks Jonathan again, why is David not here? Jonathan explains again, and this time Saul gets so angry. In fact, we pick it up in verse 24. Let me pick it up here in verse 24. Let me summarize a little bit more, and then we'll pick it up in verse 24. So Saul gets angry, and Jonathan has to go back and now communicate to David that David's got to go on the run. So here, we pick it up in verse 24. So David hid in the field when the new moon feast came. Yep, we talked about this. The king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall opposite Jonathan, and Abner sat next to Saul. But David's place was empty. Saul said nothing that day, for he thought, something must have happened to David to make him ceremonially unclean. Surely he is unclean. But the next day, the second day of the month, David's place was empty again. Then Saul said to his son Jonathan, why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today? And Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked for permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go because our family is observing a sacrifice in the town, and my brother has ordered me to be there. If I have found favor in your eyes, let me go and see my brothers. So, Dad, that's why David is not here at the king's table. Look at verse 30. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Wow. Now, we have a phrase like that in English, right? And it's just as offensive in English. Just as offensive in English as it is here. He says, don't I know that you, Jonathan, have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? This guy's such an insulter. As long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, talking about David, neither you, Jonathan, or your kingdom will ever be established. Now, send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. Why should he be put to death, Dad? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled a spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Just one more verse. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger on the second day of the feast and did not eat because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. So Jonathan goes out to the field, shoots the 3 arrows far, sends a kid to go and collect the arrows, and then sends the kid back into the town. And then we read this exchange between Jonathan and David in verse 41. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. They both kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. When I was in 8th grade, I became really good friends with this guy named Michael Cohen. Michael lived on the CB base in Port Hueneme. We went to school together, became really good friends in 8th grade, hung out all summer, hung out all freshman year. He and I were best friends, went places with each other, hung out on the weekends. He would come over and sleep over at my house. I would sleep over at his house. We liked the same movies. We liked the same TV shows. We made the same jokes. We just became really, really good, close friends. And then the summer between our freshman year and sophomore year, his dad got new orders and got transferred to Pensacola, Florida. And so that summer, he came over. His parents brought him over. It was like a day before he was getting ready to leave. And he brought him over, and just for us to kind of say goodbye. It was a little awkward. It's like 2 15-year-old guys, like, yeah, bro, I'll miss you. Like, what do you do there, right? And it was a little bit, he actually brought me a plant. I don't know if that's like normally what high school guys do but like he brought me a plant, like, hey, my mom got this plant and said I should give it to you so that, you could remember our friendship, and here's the plant, right? And we actually kept the plant for a long time. It was actually kind of cool. But then, he walked out the door and he left. I literally never saw Michael Cohen again. And I remember going back into my room that day after he left, and I was really bummed. Like, I had other friends and other really good friends, but Michael and I we just connected. We just had a really unique friendship. And so I remember going back into my room, and I was not a big crier, but I remember sitting in my room and like crying a little bit over this. I was like, man, I'm really bummed. Like, I don't know if I'm ever going to see this guy again. I remember being really, really sad about it. But you know what Michael didn't do? Michael didn't kiss me, because that would have been weird, right? And for some of us, when we read this passage, we're like hung up on the fact that David and Jonathan kissed each other here in verse 41, because we're not really used to the idea of friends kissing each other, right? Like, a good solid hug is fine, but Josh, if you come at me and try to give me a kiss, no offense, but I'm pulling away, right? I mean, that's just kind of, for us, the word kiss has a romantic connotation, right? But in the ancient world, and even among a lot of modern cultures today, a kiss was a common way to show affection between friends and family members. We see this in Genesis 27 when Isaac kisses his son Jacob before he blesses him. In Genesis 33, Esau and Jacob kiss when they're reconciled. They're brothers and they reconcile their relationship. In Genesis 45, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he kisses them. In Exodus 4, Aaron kisses his brother Moses. In Exodus 18, Moses kisses his father-in-law. Guys, try that. See how that goes over. I don't know. Right? In Ruth chapter 1, Orpah kisses her mother-in-law Naomi. In Matthew 26, how does Judas betray Jesus? With a customary greeting among friends, right? A kiss. It's not even just in the Bible. In the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh kisses his friend Enkidu. This is a common way in the ancient world and among many cultures today to express friendship or affection. So even though it might seem strange to us, a kiss was a very common in the ancient world. And so what we have here at the end of chapter 20 is this really heartbreaking scene among friends in which David and Jonathan, two best friends who have pledged their friendship to each other, go their separate ways. In fact, they're only going to see each other one more time for the rest of their lives. One last encounter between these two best friends. We read about it in 1 Samuel chapter 23. In verse 15, David is on the run from Saul. He's been on the run for quite some time. He's hiding in caves. He's hiding behind rocks. He's hiding in fields. And in verse 15, it says, while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh, and listen to this, I love this, and helped him find strength in God. That's a good friend, right? Helped him find strength in God. He said, don't be afraid. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. And that was the last time that these two best friends ever saw each other alive. Because at the very end of 1 Samuel, in chapter 31, we learned that both Jonathan and his father Saul have been killed by the Philistines. And when David hears about it, the Bible tells us that he tore his clothes, which is an ancient symbol of lament, an ancient way of expressing lament. He tore his clothes and he began to weep and he began to mourn for both Saul and Jonathan. And then when you jump ahead to 2 Samuel chapter 1, David actually writes a song about the death of Saul and Jonathan. He teaches it to the people. It becomes a song that they sort of sing together. And in verse 26 of 2 Samuel chapter 1, David says this. He says, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. Now again, David's not implying any sort of romantic relationship here. He's simply describing what C.S. Lewis was talking about in the quote that I read earlier about ancient friendships. That in the ancient world, a close friend was considered the apex of all human relationships. And David had just lost his. And he was mourning the loss of his closest, best friend. So as we think about the story of David and Jonathan this morning, I want to ask you 2 questions. One, do you have a friend like Jonathan? And 2, are you a friend like Jonathan to anyone else? As you think about your life, as you think about your friendships, as you think about your relationships, do you have a friend like Jonathan? And 2, are you a friend like Jonathan to anyone else? When everyone else might answer the question, do you have a friend like Jonathan, would they think of you? And if your answer to either one of those questions is either no or, I don't know, I want to offer you a few practical steps this morning, just as we get ready to wrap up. Just a couple of practical steps for you to consider. So I'm going to describe sort of 4 scenarios. The first scenario is this. If you don't really have any close friendships, and that could be for a variety of reasons. You're new to the area, you've lost some friends, you're at a life stage where it's just harder to sort of maintain friends, or other friends your age kind of have different things going on. Whatever the situation is, if you kind of would go, I don't know that I really have any really close friends, then here's what I want to invite you to do. Consider joining a small group here at the church. I know that sounds almost cliche, but consider joining a small group here at the church. And then when you get into that small group, look around the small group and go, okay, I don't know if I really have a whole lot of, in common with all of these people, but let me find one that I at least have something in common with. And then invite them to hang out. Hey, do you want to get coffee sometime in the next couple of weeks? And yes, it might feel weird, and yes, it might feel awkward, and it might even feel needy. But the only way to have friends is to make friends, right? And so it may require a step of initiation. The second scenario is this. If you have close friends, but if you're being honest, you haven't really prioritized spending time with them, you just other stuff going on, then would you just consider maybe reaching out this week to one of those friends and just making plans to spend time together? Hey, let's go grab coffee. Hey, you want to come over and watch the football game together? Hey, you want to go on a hike? Hey, you want to get the kids together at the park for a little bit? The third scenario is this. If you have close friends, but you tend to stay on the surface and not really go very deep. I've got friends. Oh, yeah, we hang out all the time. Okay, but do they really know what's going on in your life? Do you really? Do you have that kind of deep friendship like Jonathan and David, or do you tend to kind of stay more surface? Well, if that describes you, then maybe consider getting together with a friend this week and opening up about something going on in your life. Some of you are like, okay, yeah, that's too far. That's too much. Just consider maybe getting together with one of the friends. Hey, you want to get together and just say, hey, can I just share something that's going on in my life? What, are they going to say no? Are they really going to sip their coffee and be like, nah, right? No. They're going to say, yeah, sure. In fact, they'll probably really be really honored that you would actually trust them enough to open up. And who knows, maybe they might say, wow, I didn't know that. Can I share something with you? And who knows, maybe this week that friendship just goes a little bit deeper, not in a weird way, but in a really beautiful, healthy way. And fourth, if you have really good friends that you feel like you can rely on, but you're not sure that they would say the same about you, then this week, would you consider being more sacrificial in your friendship? Maybe this week, looking for an opportunity this week to serve your friend more sacrificially. Now, as I look around this room and I think about our stories, I recognize there's probably all kinds of other friendship challenges based on life stage and personality and lived experience, right? Some of you don't have time for friends at this stage in your life. Some of you don't want deep friendships because you've been burned or hurt in the past by a friend. Some of you have tried to have deep friendships, but it just doesn't seem like other people are willing to try as much as you're willing to try. Some of you have been taken advantage of, or you've been in really unhealthy, toxic friendships, right? Some of you just prefer to be alone. If you're being honest, you're like, you know what? I just prefer to be alone. Prefer to be alone with my books. Prefer to be alone with my phone. Prefer to be alone with my Netflix account. And if you find yourself in any of those situations, I'm just going to invite you to pray about this and just see if maybe, just maybe, the Lord might be prompting you to take a step this week or this month towards building or rebuilding deep friendships. Because like Jenny Allen says in her book, Find Your People, she says, as messy as relationships might be, we cannot live life alone. We have to figure this out. So here's how I want to close this morning. I want to close this morning by reading something that Jesus said on the night before he was crucified. He gathered his 12 disciples together in this little second-story room, and he said to them these words. He said, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And then Jesus says this. He says, you are my friends if you do what I command. He says, I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. He says, instead, I have called you friends. Church, there is a deep theological reality contained in this exchange. And that is this, that the God of the universe longs to call you his friend. The God of the universe and you, friends. Not just a slave, not his servant, not his vassal, not his pet, his friend. And today, I don't know, some of you probably don't feel much like his friend, right? As you think about your life, or you think about your circumstances, or you think about the decisions that you've made, or the things you've done, or the things you've said, you may not believe that God could ever possibly want you as his friend. But that is the shocking and scandalous beauty of the gospel. That the God of the universe wants you as his friend. I'm going to invite you to stand this morning. And as you stand, I want to close with these words. These words come from a famous book called Knowing God by a guy named J.I. Packer. And he says this. He says, there is a great cause for humility at the thought that God sees all the twisted things about me and yet calls me his friend. He continues. He says, there is also a great incentive to worship and love God because for some unfathomable reason, he wants me as his friend and desires to be my friend and has given his son to die for me in order to realize this purpose. Friends, let's pray. Lord God, we don't get it. We don't understand. We don't deserve it. And yet, you have extended this invitation to us to become not just your servant, not just your slave, but to enter into real relationship with you, to be reconciled into right relationship with you, where we become your sons and your daughters, and even a friendship with you, a real relationship. And Lord, some of us in this room have that, and we thank you for that. Some of us aren't sure that we really do have that, and yet we long for it. Lord, would you draw us deeper into relationship with you? And Lord, for those of us in this room that are like, I definitely don't have that. I can't even picture or imagine that. God, would you reveal this truth? And would you draw us into that kind of friendship and relationship with you? Thank you for the example of David and Jonathan. Thank you for the example that sets for us. Thank you for the inspiration and the encouragement and even perhaps a bit of conviction that brings to us this morning. May we be the kind of friends who bring glory and honor to you and point other people in our lives, our friends, to you in everything we say, think, and do. And help us to find friends who can do the same for us. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus, and all God's people said,